Alright folks, welcome to Chapter 4 Game Worlds. And this is a really short chapter. I think there's only like 12 slides, except for the objectives. So, the objectives, blah 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 blah, blah blah, and blah. So, Game World. What is the Game World? So, it's the imaginary place where the events of the game occur. And it's not just the background or the art style. There's so much more that's involved in that. So it's presented by images, sounds, and there are other issues that we'll talk about when we think about game worlds. Now, not all games have a game world. If you think about Tetris, Tetris didn't really have a game world. So think more. I like to use MMOs in this example because it just fits better. They have a culture, they have an aesthetic, they have moral values. There's good, there's bad, there's the struggle between the two. And sometimes the line between good and bad is not so clear. So game worlds take many different shapes. If I look at a game like the Elder Scrolls series, this is Elder Scrolls Online, and it's typically dark. I mean, there's always like shadows and things like that, and they kind of use that to kind of build the dark and scary world and how it's a dangerous place. And then if you look at a game like Terra Online, most of the places in Terra are bright, vibrant, and that's really more of an art style choice because that was developed in the East and not the West. But in Terra, you're more like you're almost like a god. You're all powerful. Where in Elder Scrolls, it's more like you're a hero, but there are things that can kill you. And then you look at games like Star Wars: The Old Republic, and it has a kind of a cartoony feel. And then it's in the science fiction kind of genre. And some people like the cartoon look, and some people don't. I know people that would never play World of Warcraft, even though it was a really good game back in its day, just because of the cartoony graphics. But graphics like this they're easier to draw. You can make them faster, and they require a lot less load on your PC than something like Terra or the Elder Scrolls Online, which means people with older PCs could use them or play those. All right, so the purpose of the game world is to entertain, to create and sustain interest. Anytime there's a game that's coming out that's based in a science fiction universe, I typically have immediate interest because I want to check that out. And sometimes the purpose is just to sell the game. World of Warcraft and Star Wars Star Wars: The Old Republic and a couple other games have moved or are moving to the cartoony style graphics because it allows a lot more people on PCs to play the games because they run well on older machines, and you don't have to have the $600 gaming video card to run max settings. All right, so your book talks about dimensions of a game world, and they mention 5 of them. So physical, temporal, environmental, emotional, and ethical. So the physical dimension, think about physical things. What can I see? How big is the map? How many maps are there? How long are the levels? The bigger the map, the more content you've got to put into that map. Nobody likes big empty spaces in maps. There are a couple of indie games that kind of suffer from that. Mortal Online is an MMO made by a small indie team, and there are large spaces on the map where there's really nothing. You just kind of you're running through them. All right, so when we're talking about physical, is it 2D? Is it 2.5, which is kind of the isometric view? Is it 3D? Is it 4D? 3D is now a standard on PCs. And then scale, really the absolute size of the objects. Are they huge? There are some games, or there are some maps in Call of Duty where you're like a mouse and you're in a huge room and you're running through mouse holes and things like that. Duke Nukem Forever had a mechanic where there were some maps where you would shrink down and you were riding like a little RC car and doing other weird stuff. And then your boundary. How do you establish that physical boundary? Okay, you've reached the edge of the map. Does it just stop and there's nothing else drawn there? Is the edge of the map really like a mountain range where you can't cross, which is typically what we see? Or is it just an ocean where you can kind of see across? All right, and then the temporal dimension. This defines the way time is treated in the game. And different games treat times differently. Typically, your games, the game time runs much faster than regular time, and that way, as you play, you can see day and night cycles. It would be pretty boring if every time you played during the day, the sun was always out in your game, and every time you played at night, it was always dark out. so that people who worked the afternoon shift and came home to play at 11 o'clock at night would always have to play the game in the dark. So that's one reason they do it. Another reason is so you can see the day and night cycles and kind of get a feel for that kind of stuff. So it's more like a living, breathing world. Some games actually allow you to adjust the speed of time. You know, the Elder Scrolls, the single-player games, allowed you to go to an inn and lay down, and you could set and say, hey, move forward 8 hours. Games like Prince of Persia allowed you to actually stop time or slow time, so you kind of go with slow-mo mode, but it also allowed you to jump back 5 seconds. So if something bad happened, you could just jump back 5 seconds, and you could avoid that. So environmental describes the world's appearance and atmosphere. Games typically from the East, Korea, that kind of thing, typically have very vibrant colors, and they over-sexualize the characters, and their weapons are huge. In games like Final Fantasy, oversized weapons are typical. Whereas in games like Terra Online, the less armor your character wears, the higher level the armor is. So what's the art style going to be? What are the buildings going to look like? What's the plant life going to look like? So yeah, anything about the environment. And then as for the audio, what kind of audio sounds are we going to have? All right, and then cultural context. You got to be careful with this, and think about your target market for the game. If your game is going to be released on Steam or Xbox Live or something like this, those are worldwide, and you could be denying an entire culture or country based on some of the choices you make. World of Warcraft had to make some very different art sets for the undead characters because they could not release the game in China showing the bones or the flesh, something like that. So they had to redo all that artwork in order to release it over in China. But again, they ended up with millions of subscribers in China, so it was worth their effort. But also, when you're designing the game world, you have to think about the culture that's going to be generated inside your game. How do the NPCs act? Are they all evil? Is this like a thief game where everybody's an evil thief? Are there any social organizations? So all that has to be kind of built into your game. And then physical surroundings, every man-made object. And again, if it's a horror game, you don't want it to be bright and vibrant. You want it to be dark and dingy. And there's a sense, include as much detail as possible until it hurts gameplay. In your first couple games, unless you're working for a major studio, if you're indie developing, I'd like to avoid this, and here's why. You could spend years just redoing the artwork and trying to put more detail into your game. Where, as an indie developer, sometimes the gameplay is a lot more valuable than the art style. Think about Super Meat Boy. The main character was a chunk of meat, and the little saw blades that spun around were pretty much in almost every map. And yet, so the artwork wasn't. It wasn't fanatical. It was nice, but it wasn't fantastic. But the gameplay was so good, and getting through those levels was so cool that's what made that game sell. So now, when you go to big companies, NCSoft and Turbine and Valve and that kind of stuff, that's where that artwork really kind of comes into play. All right, moving on. So the emotional dimension. What emotion is created in the player? If you've ever played the and I can't think of his name. He's the cop, and they kill his family or something, and you have to avenge them. Obviously, that creates emotion in the player, because now you're like, I gotta go kill these guys because they killed my family and stuff like that. Whereas if you play a game like Star Wars: The Old Republic and you play the Imperial Agent, it's like, oh man, some terrorists just blew up Darth Jadis of the Dark Council. I gotta get that mofo, that kind of stuff. So you want to build some kind of emotional. You want to also build emotional attachment to the characters in the game and the game world itself. A lot of people play World of Warcraft and have continued to play World of Warcraft because they're so emotionally invested. They've created a character to max level. They've raided and have a bunch of really cool gear. They have a bunch of money in the game. They have things that they don't want to lose. Other games are kind of capitalizing on that. One game in particular is Archage. which is a Korean game, but it's published over here in North America by Tryon. In Archage, if you stop subscribing, you lose your house. So if you're a player and you subscribe, you can own land and you can have a house. But if you stop paying, then you lose your house. So like your house goes away and somebody can grab your plot, and then it's gone. So you would have to go, if you would have to resubscribe later on and try to find a new plot if you could, and it'll probably be in a crappy area, and then you hopefully get your house down. So a lot of times they build that emotional feeling into the game. Hey, this is my house. I spent all this time decorating it. I don't want to lose it. So it's worth paying $15 a month until I come back and play this again. All right, they also mentioned, avoid the paint by numbers emotional content. And you've all played those games where it's like, oh gosh, they're trying to make me scared, and I'm not really scared, and blah blah, that kind of stuff. All right, and then the ethical dimension defines right and wrong in the game. A lot of people criticize Star Wars: The Old Republic for this, because like when you get your choices, you can look and it says, and the one choice might read like it's going to be good, and it's actually bad. There was one mission in the early, the Bounty Hunter or the Imperial Agent. You're on Hutta, or the little moon thing. I can't remember what the starter world was, but anyway, there's an old couple, and the old guy like makes his money by by sneaking through the junkyard and stealing these power converters. And then he's gotten hurt, so he can't do it anymore. So they're going to die because they don't have enough money for food and stuff. So they need to get these power converters so they can sell them. So you sneak into the place and steal the power converters, but then the foreman comes out and says, "Hey, don't! If you steal these, I'll get in trouble, and the Hutts will kill my family." So then you have to make that ethical choice. Do I steal these and let this guy and his family die? Or do I not steal them so I can save his family, which kills the old guy and his wife, who won't be able to have any money, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of cool ethical choices in some games like that. So that was a tough moral choice. Alright, and then it says avoid violence for its own sake. Although nowadays, with Grand Theft Auto, some people just jump in there and just want to do violence. But typically, you want to give it a purpose. There are times in like the Star Wars: The Old Republic where, as a Sith, you can really get violent, and like there's a woman that you throw against the wall and smack her around in front of her kids, and just get weird. Anyway, your book also mentions don't mix the two. And what I mean is, if the ethics are unreal, don't make the graphics or the visuals unreal or realistic. You can't have a realistic world with unrealistic ethics. So kind of like mold the two together. If everything's going to be unrealistic, then make everything unrealistic, or make everything realistic. But don't try to blend the two. Alright, and then realism. So all games, no matter how realistic, require some simplification. And I see this argued all the time on the forums and stuff, where someone's like, oh, well, that's not how it is in the real world. Well, who wants to live in the real world? I don't play video games so I can go get a job and work 8 hours. That's not what I want to do in a video game. I do that in real life. I want to go have fun in the video game. If making the game world unrealistic makes me have more fun, then I'm all for it. And that's something where you can kind of mix and match. Like you can have realistic physics, but cartoony graphics. So, and even the biggest simulation games, like the racing games, things like that, still have some more simplistic aspects of them that are not really real. All right. So, summary: you should now understand how to define the purpose of the game world, how to create the physical dimension, the passage of time, establishing the environment, all this other stuff. So it depends on what game you're making. Obviously, you're not going to make an MMO. Nobody comes out the door and says, oh, I'm going to make an MMO by myself. Well, good luck with that. You should probably start with maybe a 2D platformer because that's really the best way to learn the tools that are out there and to learn what goes into making games. So start with that, and then think, okay, now what are my levels going to look like? Are they going to be science fiction based? Are they going to be fantasy based? Am I going to be underground like in Terraria? Something like that. and then go find the art assets or design your art assets. And then start, as you're doing the art assets, think about how am I going to handle these different things? How big is the game world going to be? What's the emotion I'm trying to create in the player? Is the player going to be constantly running away from things because he's going to be scared, or is he going to be like a god and be able to crush everything? So you've read the chapter, you've kind of seen this stuff. Just make sure you kind of keep these things in mind when you're working on your game. And again, if you have any questions, make sure you drop me an email.